Here we go. Starting the recording. So welcome everyone. Today we have Stefani Crabtree speaking. And so Stefani, I met her 2 years ago at Complex Systems Summer School in Santa Fe. She's an excellent speaker. She does research that I didn't know existed until I started speaking about it. She's got an interesting trajectory, but without taking too much away from it. She's an assistant professor in social environmental modeling at Utah State University, and she's also an ASU SFI Center for Biosocial Complex Systems Fellow at the Santa Fe Institute. And as I learned from just now, you're all also currently in Santa Fe, right? So yeah, I'm very excited to have you here. Thanks for agreeing to speak, and take it away, Stefani.
Great. Thank you so much, Alice. And thank you very much for inviting me to come give this seminar today. I'm doing that awkward thing of starting my talk while we're here. Okay, great. Can you, there we go. You can see everything. Yes, as Alice mentioned, we met just a couple years ago when she came for the Complex Systems Summer School, where we connected. I did a short talk on archaeology and modeling. And so my work today, I'm going to be talking to you about this discipline that I've kind of invented, that I've called archaeoecology, where we're trying to understand the place of humans in ecosystems in the past so we can understand the present and the future. As she mentioned, I'm an assistant professor of socio-environmental modeling at Utah State University in the Department of Environment and Society. I'm also at the Santa Fe Institute. Feel free to email me. My email address is up there, or tweet at me or whatever to contact me. I also, there we go. Okay, I also pulled 2 PhDs, which Alice was surprised about. During my time at Washington State University, I was approached by a university in France looking to have me do a carte tutelle, which is a program that was set up by the government to essentially get a second PhD for about 50 to 75% more work. Excuse me, my allergies since just arriving back in Santa Fe are a little off the charts, so I'll try not to cough in your ears. So in 2016, I received my PhD from Washington State University, and in 2017, I received my PhD from Université de Franche-Comté, and the Franche-Comté one is kind of environmental science. So I combine these anthropology and environmental science things together. I also hold affiliations at a few different external organizations, and the work I'm presenting today are my opinions, not the opinions of these other organizations. Anyways, let's get going. So Alice has seen this slide before when I talked at SFI a few years ago, and I find it a little ironic to revisit it because the general spiel that I give when I give public talks is that we're facing some pretty massive challenges today. And the examples that I give are climate change, diasporas of people, and pandemics. And when I gave this example 3 years ago at the SFI Summer School, we were not in the midst of a global pandemic. We had the H1N1 pandemic back in 2009, but that had been pretty small potatoes compared to what we're dealing with now. And so what I usually say is that these things can seem frightening, but we can look to the archaeological record for hope and for inspiration and for ways to understand how people dealt with these things in the past. I think for me, this is very empowering because archaeology to me gives us an example of how we're not alone, that people have dealt with these kinds of things for a very long time. And if you're interested in my ideas on this, I published a short piece 2 weeks ago through the Santa Fe Institute's Transmissions Coronavirus series that we're doing about the lessons we can take from the archaeological past, specifically looking at one major pandemic that happened in Greece about 300 BC for today. But in this way, I think that archaeology provides a unique opportunity to calibrate our understanding of the present and the future on the past. So if we can have good data-driven archaeology where we understand what people do, that this can be really helpful for us as we confront our challenges now and into the future. Now, of course, there are also challenges in archaeology. If we were to be simultaneously transported 6 feet apart from each other into Chaco Canyon, in the upper left-hand corner, we would find these potsherds. And so these potsherds are all pieces of whole vessels. We very, very rarely these days find whole pots on the ground. So as archaeologists, we need to be able to take the pieces of something, the fragments of the past, and extrapolate to understand what the whole was. So in the example of pottery, we can look at these tiny pieces, we can see what they were as a whole, but I can tell you just from this picture that all the sherds on the outside are local, and the one in the center was traded in from 300 miles away. And so by using these tiny pieces, that can tell us something about the network of connection of the people in Chaco Canyon in AD 1000. And so that is one of the small things that we can get from these challenges. Now, the archaeological record, it may be pieces, but we often get a lot of it. In the lower right-hand corner, you see a picture of Hoko rocks up in Washington State, where Alice is joining us from. And here we have 12,000 layers of unique depositional context. This picture is from Dale Crow's. And so if we want to understand anything about what happened in a specific season or a specific year, or if there were trends over time, we have to drill down through massive amounts of stuff from the past to look at the fragments of the past. But I think one of the biggest challenges of archaeology is understanding the social processes from the physical objects that we have. For example, again, if we were in Chaco Canyon, you'd see something like this. Now, if we look at these are mealing bins. So these are places where people in the past ground corn cobs down into corn flour. And what we can tell from here is these are very formal. They're built in place. So these are not portable manos and metates. We can see that there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of them. And if we were to do an analysis of the residue on those grinding slicks, we would say, indeed, they were grinding maize or corn in the past. But what this does not tell us is the social relationships that formed around these kinds of activities. We know from the ethnographic record, this is a picture of Hopi around the turn of the 19th to the 20th century. We know that young women would get together and they would look forward to preparing food for their families because it was a time that they could chat with their friends. They would take this time to talk about a festival they're excited about, or how their parents were being mean to them, or about a boy that they liked. And so these relationships were essential for the formation of bonds through life and for society. So the question is, how do you get from this to this? And this is why I'm drawn to complex adaptive system science. In complex adaptive system science, of which network analysis and network science is a part, what we can do is we can look at the large whole and we can start to drill down and get an idea of the interacting relationships of individuals. And so in this way, network analysis, like I'll be presenting today, shows how individuals or individual species interact to form this whole, and how these cascading consequences of interactions can lead to something large that we can detect archaeologically. So the theme of this talk is that only through building gigantic networks, so the networks I'm showing you are gigantic by archaeological standards, can we understand how humans are embedded in ecosystems and how ecosystems in turn impact people. So this is the theme, this is the take-home message, and I hope I'll be able to deliver this through my 2 examples. Here's where we're going. I'll be starting with my work of modeling the past. So I'll be using models, these food web models, to understand the human place of ecosystems among ancestral Pueblo people of the American Southwest. Then I'll move to my work that I did at my postdoc at Penn State, where I lived and worked with the Martu Aboriginal people in the Western Desert of Australia and built food webs similar to those I did for the Pueblo people, to understand how the removal of Martu Aboriginal people actually led to extinctions in Australia. And then I'll very briefly talk about the work that I have now and going on into the future. So without further ado, let's begin here with the Pueblo. But first, I need to begin with a story. So in the late 1800s, 2 cowboys, the Wetherill brothers, were driving their cattle up the canyons of southwestern Colorado from one pasture to another. As they were riding along, one of them looked up and he was absolutely astonished at what he saw. Up in the south-facing recesses of these cliffs were these beautiful castle-like structures. Tapped his brother on the shoulder, they tied their horses up, let their cattle wander off to do whatever it is cattle do, and clambered up the side. They were astounded to see whole pots sitting on the ground. They found entire storage bins full of corn cobs, perfectly preserved, waiting to be ground into flour, but nobody was around. They got back to town, they called the press, and then pretty soon a national and then international obsession with the ancestral Pueblo people began. People wanted to know who these people were. They wanted to know why they left and where they went. Of course, we work with descendant communities, so we know who these people were. Descendant communities live down here in New Mexico and Arizona and around. We wanted to know why they left, and of course this has also been pretty well established by work by my colleague Scott Ortman and various others, but the question of why they left is still an open one. At first, the idea was hostile invaders from the north, Athabascan-speaking peoples, came in and drove them out. Well, on further analysis, it looks like the Athabascan-speaking peoples who came in a couple hundred years after the ancestral Pueblo people had already left. So that hypothesis was gone. Then in the 1950s, as tree ring studies were starting to come online, there was this hypothesis of a great drought that happened right around the 1300s. But as analyses got better and better, it looked like not only had Pueblo people lived through worse droughts in the past, but by the time the great drought appeared, most people were already gone from that region. So that leaves an open question. So I think to understand why people left, you have to understand how they lived. And so my work looks at the 700-year trajectory of the Ancestral Pueblo Society, a very long-lived society in this region. And today I'll be talking about the human-environment interaction, though Alice has seen me talk a bit about the human-human interaction that I've done. And these computational approaches, which are pretty new in archaeology, honestly, can be a really beautiful window to the past for understanding all of this stuff. I do want to mention very briefly that I am a new assistant professor at Utah State, and I'm always looking for students or people who want to come work with me as postdoc and all that. So if this stuff sounds exciting to you at all, shoot me an email. I'm a nice person. We can chat, okay? All right, so if we're going to talk about food webs, which is where I'm going with this network science seminar, we need to go all the way back to Darwin. So when he published On the Origin of Species toward the very end of the book, he has this beautiful quote. "It is interesting to contemplate an entangled bank. These elaborately constructed forms, dependent on each other in so complex a manner, have all been produced by laws acting around us." So in the treatise where he brought us the principles of evolution, he's also telling us that there are these complex interactions of feedings that happen among individuals in an ecosystem. And so this really catalyzed the study of trying to understand the network of feeding interactions. So a food web is a directional network of feeding relations. And you can see a very simplified version on the right-hand side there. What you are seeing here, since you're all network scientists, I can just throw out jargon at you, and I'm so excited about that. But you see the nodes there are species or groups of species, taxa, and then the links are feeding links. So this has a vertical structure, and so that is showing you the trophic level. So trophic level means at the very bottom you have plants, for example, producers, primary producers, and as you go up you have primary consumers, which are herbivores, secondary consumers, and all the way up to true carnivores that only eat other fleshy organisms. You might notice that there are some nose rings on some of the nodes there, and that indicates cannibalism. So in a lot of species, you end up having cannibalistic properties. Tigers sometimes eat their young, and so we'll create a link there. So by creating these webs of feeding interactions, the things that you can understand are the structure of the community. How many primary producers, plants or other autotrophic organisms, do you have? How many predators? How many herbivores? How many omnivores? Those kinds of things are really important for understanding something like community stability. So in community stability, if you have one plant that is being eaten by everything else and you pull that away, that might help you understand extinctions in an ecosystem. And we can also look at energy or nutrient flow in ecosystems. So how does the energy from the very bottom, those plants that get their energy from the sun, how does that go all the way up to the carnivores? And of course, like most network studies, food web studies can show us how small changes in one part of the web can cascade throughout. So what happens if you introduce a new species? What happens with these invasive species that comes in? What happens if a species goes extinct? These are the kinds of what if scenarios that ecologists have wanted to ask for a long time that we can do with these complex computational approaches. All right, so the first food web ever published that we know of was in 1880 by Lorenzo Camarano. And this is a very simplified version of looking at those consumption links. So it's in Italian, Venetian Italian. But if you look here, you can see that there are groups of a couple words that he's drawn on top of each other. And he's trying to understand an Italian food web. And it's actually a pretty beautifully well done food web that looks at, he calls it the mutual destruction of species. So what this is we've all know about food chains. A plant grows, right? It gets eaten by an herbivore, which then gets eaten by a carnivore. But of course, we know that bunnies don't just eat maize, they also eat Chenopodium and they eat goosefoot, and they don't really eat rabbit brush. It's just called it that because they live in it. But we can have these mutualistic networks as well. And we also know that wolves aren't just going to eat rabbits, they're basically going to eat anything furry that they can get their hands on. And so once you get all those links together, you get a much more complex food web. And so the work I'm presenting you today is from my 2017 paper that literally, this is one of the food chains within there, but you can see that there are many, many more. I will deconstruct this food web a little bit more for you, but it's exactly the same as that simplified one we saw 2 slides ago, where the red balls on the bottom, those are plants. Those are the primary producers. And as we go up in the vertical axes, you go up in the food chain, essentially. And so we end up having those true carnivores at the very top. Everyone always asks who that upper right-hand corner ball is, and that is a species of nightjar that flies through the American Southwest for like 2 weeks, right about now actually, that eats a couple insects. It's very important for insect dampening, but there's not a lot there that eats it. So it looks like it's like a super carnivore, but it's not. It's just an artifact of what it eats and how it's a migrant through the region. So food webs approaches and network approaches can be useful for helping us understand a lot of different things that you can't get by just looking at the archaeological record. So by being able to create these networks, I can look at things like human vulnerability. So will this be able to tell us something about during that 700 years that people were there, how people became more vulnerable to environmental conditions over time, which may have led to decisions to depopulate the region? And then a second question that guided this research, which seems pretty basic, but is kind of revolutionary in some circles, is understanding ancestral Pueblo farmers as integral parts of the environment. In some circles, it's very easy to understand hunter-gatherers as being integral parts of the environment because they're not actually augmenting anything. But this was the first study that looked at farmers within these ecosystems in a full-scale way to show how they embed themselves and how that changes the ecosystem over time. All right, so what I did, and I'm not going to show you every single thing that I did, we'll look at what I'm calling the composite food web or the meta food web. And then from this gigantic food web, I can pull out individual things that I care about, like food webs from individual sites or food webs from very specific temporal slices, or what is the food web of a wolf, for example. I can just pull out that directly from this composite food web. But these meta food webs are very useful for looking at the overall connectedness of an entire ecosystem and looking at what the overall cascading effects of invasions and removals are. I'll show you a little bit about human prey choice and how those choices in fact cascade across the entire food web. And then I'll show you how hunting and farming decisions impacted the entire environment of the Four Corners region. Excuse me. Putting together this work is not very sexy. It's a lot of sitting at your desk, looking at old site reports and databases, blowing off dust from, that's literally a bunch of site reports from one specific excavation in the Southwest, and then compiling that stuff outward. I apologize. So how you do this work, how you create these networks. I begin first with excavations done in the region. What this tells us is what people brought home and put in their middens or trash heaps over time. The Southwest has amazing preservation. As I mentioned in my introduction, there are entire storage cysts full of corn cobs from at least 1400 years ago that I have seen there. And so that tells you what kind of desiccation we deal with. And so what we can do from these archaeological data is I can look at all of the animal bones that have come out, all of the plants, the pollen, everything, to create a list of presence and absence. So that creates a list of presence, everything that we knew that was there at these different time slices, because archaeological excavations are essentially someone moved in at this time, they left at this time. It gives us a perfect little window of what it was like that 30 years or 50 years or 100 years. And so from that, then, I construct what the environment likely looked like. Now, there have been changes in the 700 years since the Ancestral Pueblo people walked away from Mesa Verde, but the environment has remained relatively similar. And so then I build out from these obvious things that existed back then to animals and plants that exist there today. And so then when I'm coding this, I have a binary thing of, was this there in the archaeological past, or is this something I'm inferring from the present? And so this then creates layers of certainty and uncertainty. I see a question coming up. I'm happy if it's important to go to right now, or we can wait till the end. Alice, you choose.
I think I sent a private message to Gary, and Gary responded to all. That's what happened.
Aha, excellent. No worries. I'm not looking at questions, so if something comes up that is essential, would you read it to me?
Yes, will do.
Thank you. All right, so we have things we know, things we think we know, and then I have to go around and get information about every single plant and animal, what those animals ate, what they likely ate. And so this comes from ecological studies of gut contents, for example, of a lot of the deer in the region, follow studies, we saw this amphibian eat these things, etc. And I use all of these databases. Here are some of them. And I mark what I used to make sure that this is reproducible. This is a living document. And so it changes over time. I'm actually working right now on fixing up the entomology, because when I started creating this project actually started with me as a summer school student at the Santa Fe Institute in 2011. The insect data was terrible for the Southwest, and now it's getting a lot better. And so I'm working on making this living document much, much better and more comprehensive. But I should note that there are paleo food webs from like the Burgess Shale, for example, and that we don't actually know. Many of these animals do not exist anymore, trilobites, for example. And so we're making inferences based on body size and what their mandibles look like and whether or not they likely ate something. And so I'm following best practices established by ecological science, making these trophic networks based on all of these inferential data that can be updated over time. So it creates a pretty realistic study of all of the animals and plants that lived there during that time. So I don't believe I told you what time period. So we're looking at AD 600 when people arrived in the region to AD 1300 when they migrated away. And these people who came in, they brought with them a whole suite of farming products. 80% of their diet was maize, which we know from isotopic studies. And then the other 20% comes from kind of everything else. They also grew squash and beans, which they brought in with them, but they foraged a ton. And that 80% is an average kind of later. Earlier on, maybe 50 to 60% people foraged more. And later on, people became much more dependent on maize. And so that gives you an idea of who these people were, what they did, and how I put this whole food web together. All right, so I'm gonna show you how humans are connected to a larger web. I'll show you how humans are versatile and can switch among prey. So this is you've heard of specialists like pandas that eat, you know, one specific thing, and you've heard of generalists that eat a lot of different things. This is Potts's idea of being a versatilist, as he pronounces it, of being able to decide if you're going to generalize or specialize. Like right now, we might all be eating one thing because we're at home and depressed and we love Oreos. But a lot of times we might be deciding to vary our diets. You know, we know that that's a good thing to do. And so this Food Web's approach, you can actually constrict diets and expand diets as you see fit. And then I'll show you how vulnerable the primary prey of humans is, which impacts how vulnerable people are. All right, so you remember this diagram. This is the composite food web, every single organism within the Four Corners region. So there are 334 unique taxa represented with over 12,000 connections among them. So when people think about a complex ecosystem, many times they think of rainforests, like up where Alice is. But what I want to show with this is that desert ecosystems are also very complex. And one really cool thing about desert ecosystems is there's a lot of redundancy. So what that means is if you're a mourning dove and 99% of your diet is seeds, which yes, that is true, and those seeds don't come in, 1% of your diet can be insects, and so you can change. So there's a whole lot of redundancy in diet within this food web. There are 7 different hummingbird species, so we have many different plant pollinators that can pollinate these plants in case one doesn't migrate into the region in 1 year. That red arrow that's right there, that's pointing toward humans. And so these are the Ancestral Pueblo people. And when I've given this talk before, some people are surprised to see that it's not man the hunter at the very top of the food web. But remember, people are omnivorous and we eat a lot of different things. And while 80% of the diet is maize here in this food web, I'm only showing presence absence. So even with that presence absence, they're eating so many different plants, relying on so many different plants over time, that that kind of pulls them down in this omnivorous category. I think that's everything I need to say about that slide right now. This is the largest published and most highly resolved terrestrial food web, and the largest and most highly resolved to include humans. This is a really new way of looking at things. Ecologists generally don't like to think of people as being natural. You know, there's kind of the natural environment, and then there's us. But I think that looking at our place in ecosystems is important if we want to think about conservation or anything. Humans have been impacting ecosystems in some way or another for 200,000 years or more. And there are very few ecosystems worldwide that don't have human impacts. All right, I've already said those other 2 things, so you could read them, so I'm moving on. Here's another way to look at this food web. It's probably a little jumpy for you just based on my internet, but you can see that this layer cakiness of this food web shows how interconnected everything is. Some of the organisms that kind of pull out, they have fewer connections than others. So those that are kind of more toward the inside have many more connections. Plants are just made so that they kind of spread out so that we can see as many of the links as we want to. But what you're seeing here is a whole lot of plants, a whole lot of primary consumers, and then fewer and fewer as we go up toward carnivores, which leads to a pretty structurally sound food web. And as I mentioned before, a lot of overlapping taxa, a lot of redundancy, like hummingbirds. So if we look at connectivity, so this is a rank order of each of the taxa, how connected they are. So how many things do they eat? How many things eat them, right? So if we look at connectivity in a network sciencey way, we can see that humans are incredibly connected. They eat a whole lot of things. A few things eat them. Deer, which are native to this region, are very connected and they eat a lot of things and very many things eat them. But look at maize. So this is corn that was brought in by Ancestral Pueblo people when they migrated into the region. Maize obviously doesn't eat anything, but it's a highly connected plant. So why I'm showing you this is to show you invaders, humans, with their invasives, maize, and a naturally occurring species in this ecosystem, to show you how humans came in and embedded themselves in the ecosystem. They found this beautiful place to live and they set up shop and became incredibly connected, both them and their most consumed plant. I'm also showing you deer because we know that early on in the archaeological record, humans were primarily preying on deer. They had elk early on in a little bit, and then they kind of disappear from the archaeological record. And I can answer questions about that at the end if people have questions about that. Then they really rely on mule deer. And then by about the late 900s, mule deer start disappearing from the food web. And we think that previously people thought that this is because people overhunted them. And that is definitely true. We show that in some simulations that it doesn't take much hunting to kind of scare the deer away. But once people remove that deer, that becomes a really big sink for them to have to figure out what to do with protein. And that's also a very connected organism in the ecosystem. So that alters that whole food web. If we just look at vulnerability rank, which is what eats you, we can see that humans have a vulnerability rank of 26. So there are a few organisms that eat them. Cougars will eat baby humans if they can get them. Wolves will, coyotes will, for example. Humans occasionally, there's potentially some instances of cannibalism, but that's very toward the end, and that is a site of trauma. But we see that deer have a pretty high vulnerability rank. A lot of things like to eat deer if they can, humans included. Maize has one of the highest vulnerability ranks of a plant in this region. And remember, this is not native. So people come in, they bring this plant with them that they're cultivating, they're clearing forests to be able to grow enough corn for themselves, and they unintentionally introduce candy into the region. Other organisms love it. In fact, as I was compiling this database together, basically every single organism that eats plants will eat some part of the maize if it can get it. Today, east of this region in Alamosa, farmers have to come out into their fields during tasseling season with brooms to fend off migrating birds that come into their cornfields. And so what this means is that even though people might not be vulnerable to predation, a lot of their primary prey is. And so especially in years of drought, which we know happen frequently, people are going to have to be very protective of their food stores. So we see that the primary prey of humans was very vulnerable, both to the predation of other animals and to changing environmental conditions. Maize requires a lot of water. While Hopi maize doesn't require as much as the stuff that you might be growing in your gardens right now, it still requires water. And so we know that modern pueblos will store up to 3 years of grain just in case 1 out of 3 years they don't have enough rain to have enough of a harvest. We see that the amount of storage in the archaeological past is roughly similar to what Hopi do. And so people were trying to anticipate these environmental conditions, but they're also changing their environment as well. We know that people are deforesting over time. One of the bits of data that I brought into this giant study was looking at pollen cores. And on the feature of Mummy Lake, we see that by kind of toward the end of the occupation of the region, the nearest pollen, arboreal pollen from trees, was about 25 kilometers away. So that's very far. So people are slowly deforesting as they're planting more fields to feed their families, to make these decisions that are a local short-term decision to make sure that there's no starvation. And this in turn has cascading effects on the entire food web. So as people change the environment, they're changing what they can access. Remember that I showed that people eat a lot of different things. They can be versatilists. They can choose to eat Chenopodium. Well, they can only do that if they can find it. And what we see is that as forests get cleared farther and farther apart, as we look at those later archaeological sites, we're not seeing the pollen from these weedy substances that we should be. And so people can't rely on these foods. And so they become stuck in this rigidity trap of maize. Not only that, remember I mentioned the deer? Well, people start domesticating turkey in the late 900s, and they feed them maize as well. So people are having to double their production. And as we have less rainfall, and as we have pests coming in, which we do see, that people are in this really bad cycle. And the only way they could probably break it was by migrating away. So if people were highly connected, they might be able to switch prey. But we do know that by the end of the time, populations here reached around the populations that we see in this region today. Cortez has around 30,000 people, and they of course have supermarkets. And so this in turn led to potentially a lower quality of life. People become packed in. They have to grow maize. They have to be invested in this one specific way of living that would have had consequences down the line. So I think that by creating these big food web studies and by simulating what it looks like to take maize out, by looking at the vulnerability of maize, which is something that nobody had ever done before, this shows us why people may have made the decision to migrate to a new region. They found more sustainable practices over time, but the landscape experienced such bad environmental change by people living there for a long time that they had to take up shop and move elsewhere. And they now have very sustainable lifeways in the places where the Pueblo live today. And so this kind of work can show how these small actions, hunting and farming, can have dramatic impacts over the course of time. That's why these kinds of network studies are very cool. So I'm talking really long, I feel like. I have probably 12 more minutes. Is that okay? Thumbs up? Thumbs up. Okay. So we're going to go toward, so I published this study in 2017 in the Journal of Archaeological Science. And then I started a postdoc at Penn State working with Doug and Rebecca Bird, who have been working among the indigenous Aboriginal people, the Martu, for about 2 decades now. And they were interested in building a food web to understand what happened when people were removed. So this also has a story to begin with. If any of you have seen the Netflix show Cooked by Michael Pollan, the first episode follows the people who I lived with. So if you have Netflix, I recommend it. The first voice you hear on it, in fact, is one of the people I lived with, which is pretty cool. So until 1964, Indigenous Martu Aboriginal people lived a traditional existence in the Western Desert of Australia. They were nomadic, they were hunter-gatherers, and they had pretty much zero contact with colonists in Australia. So they're in the Great and Little Sandy Deserts, about a 13-hour drive northeast of Perth. And in 1964, the government decided they wanted to do missile testing in the empty deserts of Australia. And so they shot an experimental missile out there, and then they flew a plane over and they realized, oh my goodness, there are people there. So they sent an anthropologist out to make contact with them. There's a beautiful film called Contact that you can rent on Amazon, not the Jodie Foster movie, but a documentary that's about 12 years old now, that shows the original contact with these people. So in 1964, the government had these people removed to cattle stations and missions on the periphery and integrated them into Western society a little bit. So between 1964 and the 1980s, there were several small-bodied mammals like the mala, that's the Martu word, the rufous-hair wallaby or Lagorchestus hirsutus, that went extinct in the deserts. Many, many of these little, fuzzy, adorable mammals went extinct. And so the question is, what happened? They existed there until Martu were removed. And then when Martu returned to country in the 80s, they were not there anymore. So why is that? Well, one of the big reasons is that the environment co-evolved with Aboriginal people over the course of about 30,000 years. So people have been in Australia for 60 to 70,000 years and in the desert for about 30,000 years. And one of the things that people do in this region is they light fires. They do this throughout all of Australia, but Martu use fires for hunting. The fires are around 1 to 5 hectares. And so they create these little patches where they burn off the old growth plants that you see here. So how this works is they create a fire line one way, and then they walk to the other side, and you can see Nyalanka there lighting the bushes as she goes along. And then that burns toward each other so it doesn't spread. So it creates this beautiful little patch that they can come to in a day or two so that they can hunt. So the plants that you're seeing, they're called spinifex, and it's very similar to sagebrush. It grows about the same size. It's very spiky, And it grows in about 7 years. And so in the Western desert, this 7-year cycle of growth actually requires fire for it to have this, the specific types of growing requirements that it does. Then once those are burned off, what you can find there are goanna lizards, which are one of the primary prey of Martu today. And so that gives you an idea of what that looks like. So what this does over time is it creates a patchy mosaic. So they burn here today, and they can hunt there for a couple weeks, going out and looking for lizards. And then they'll move over and they'll burn somewhere else. And what that does is it creates this beautiful mosaic where you have different growth stages of the plants. So that in the summertime, when lightning fires strike, they have natural breaks and they don't go across the entire environment. All right, so it seems that people were keeping animals in this vulnerable region alive. When people were removed, coincidentally, animals went away. But correlation does not equal causation. And so that's why we do these kinds of network studies, to see the effects that these things happen. And I already talked about those other points. So several colleagues, including Rebecca Bleegybird, look at these fire successional stages and what animals prefer them. And here you can see those 5 stages over 7 years, and how important this is for habitat for various animals. So what I did was I interviewed people in the Western desert to look at the pre-1964 and the modern food webs and compare them to understand whether or not we could implicate people as being important for knitting this ecosystem together, for making sure that these cute little animals were able to survive. So this is same as what you've seen before, the Martu food web. This is a human-centered food web again. You can see I'm showing you a different kind of sorting on the right-hand side. That's connectivity sorted. It shows that humans are very, very connected, and behind that are a couple different animals. What those animals are invasive camels, crows, and pythons are the next most consuming species there. Why I bring this up is that within the organisms that we could identify in the Western desert, it's much less studied than a lot of other places. Humans eat more things than anyone else. They're versatilists, just like the Pueblo, where they eat something this day, a few things the other day. They move around, they make these choices, but this has a dampening effect on everything. And so this kind of grazing about impacts the whole food web in a kind of even way. So when you remove that, that causes some very strange things. Here is what the 1964 food web looks like. So these are with weights based on my interviews with the Aboriginal people. So you can see that people are getting a lot of connection from the goanna lizards, kind of in that upper left. You can see that other proteins are coming from these small-bodied mammals down on the bottom. You can see invasives are already there in 1964. The camel, the rabbit, the fox, the cat, those are obviously not native. But this gives you an idea. So what does it look like today? Well, a lot of it collapses down to store-bought foods. So it's not just flour and ham that they eat a lot of different things, but that's 80% of the diet. And then the rest of it are things that they can forage. There is a small store in the remote living community, Barngor, and I asked one of my informants what happens when the truck breaks down or it can't get the 5 hours down that dirt road. And she said, either you go hunting or you get really, really hungry. And so there's this idea of having to do trade-offs between buying food and hunting for food. But this is just to give you an idea of the change. So there you can see hunting for lizards, by the way. So we can see a change. We can see that there are extinctions, but is this normal? Food webs have natural extinctions. We know that ecosystems have natural extinctions all the time. Is the removal of people a catalyst for this? So I use simulations known as niche models, which employ essentially an Erdos-Renyi randomization, keeping that hierarchical structure of the food web, repeating that 1,000 times to look at what natural fluctuations in the food web would be, because then I can actually compare that against the modern food web. So you can't just compare apples to oranges here. There are a different number of links and a different number of nodes. You have to have simulations to do it. What I end up seeing is there's remarkable structural integrity for a lot of the food web. Yes, things change, but between the simulations, which are those red bars, the 1964, the modern data, and a hypothesized before people came back in the 80s food web, there's no difference in a lot of the structure of the food web. But what we do see is that connectivity scores that can help us predict whether or not invasions and extinctions will occur, those are not at all predictable. And so what this ends up telling us is that people, in fact, are knitting the ecosystem together. They dampen predators. One of the things that compiling this kind of massive amount of data shows you is that people are eating the snakes, for example, who in the summertime have no other natural predators other than humans. Those vulnerable summer months when the lightning strikes hit and landscape fires happen and fluffy mammals can't outrun the fires, they're being doubly burdened by having a potential mesopredator release when you have people not eating those herpetofauna and them being able to reproduce and over-reproduce. That, coupled with the fire regime change, looks like it was the nail in the coffin for a lot of these small mammals. So I said I was only going to talk a couple more minutes, and so I want to show you where this work is going so that you can see the excitement that I have for what we have going forward, and then that'll leave time for questions. So I'm the PI of the Coalition for Archaeological Synthesis funded ArchaeoEcology project, and I work with all of these wonderful people written below, and these are where all of our studies come from. So the reason we're working in these areas is they've been very well studied over time. Some places like French Polynesia, like Iceland, were very late to being colonized by people. And so we can look at what people did when they came into the region and offer very good comparison for the interesting ways that people embed themselves in ecosystems. This just shows you another way of where those places are. We're also trying to move beyond food. So animals eat things, people eat things, but we also do crazy things like we build clothes or we have structures. And so by characterizing our impacts on the ecosystem, that can potentially help us have an understanding of the complexity of human culture over time. And so one of the things that we're doing is categorizing all of this data in all of these places to be able to understand these networks of complexity. Another thing that we're doing is looking at, for each of the taxa, we can identify, let's say, these 6 top taxa for Pueblo and look at what they're used for. This shows ideas of conflicting extraction, as I call it, where you want to feed your family, so you plant a lot of maize, but then you're actually cutting down juniper and pinyon, which you need to make artifacts, to trade, to build structures, and in fact to eat. They use the ash from it to cook for various nutrients. And so there are these trade-offs that people have as they go forward, trying to make the best decisions they can. We also can look at what we call simple interactions, where maybe you pick a berry and eat it, and a complex interaction, which is people do something crazy. We make food. We bring things together in ways that these animals and plants would not be brought together otherwise. And so, for example, peaky bread, which is primarily maize, but it brings together helianthus, a sunflower, as the hood to cook it in, ash from juniper, and chenopodium dye, which actually also adds protein to the bread to create these important rituals. And so looking at these complex interactions with ecosystems and categorizing them is proving to be very fruitful. And finally, one of the other projects that I'm working on, modeling toward the future, remember I showed you this 80% of flour and ham in the summer months? Well, I actually have receipt data. And so being able to connect not only every individual organism that people hunted, but be able to look at the ways that people are embedded in the global ecosystem. And so here, Jithin, I don't know if that's how I pronounce your name, this is where your chocolate chip cookie would be. So can I connect Martu to chocolate chip cookies? The answer is yes, I can. And it's really cool. And what this can tell us is kind of the complexity of the global food system and how people outsource their vulnerability. So if you're hunting locally, you know your vulnerability. You can tell if it's hot, you can tell if it's dry. But you don't necessarily know what's happening to the flour that they buy from Bob's Red Mill from Oregon. They don't know if it was a good year for flour or if that flour is able to be milled. So can they make their chocolate chip cookies? this is one of the questions that I'm working on right now, applying for a big grant for to go forward. So I'm very excited about this work. So this work, I think, shows that networks are amazing and they can help us to know the place of humans in ecosystems. These two examples are just two of a myriad of examples of the ways that people embed themselves. We can see how people made the ecosystem worse over time with the Pueblo. We can see how people were important for the function of the ecosystem with Martu. And so by doing these kinds of network studies, we can better understand our place so we can have a more sustainable future. And I think can lead to better resilience. So I need to thank all of my collaborators. Here are many of them represented here. If any of you are watching, thank you so much for being supportive of me and my work. And thanks to all of my funders. And I'd like to open this up for questions in our last 8 minutes. Thank you. I'm gonna actually exit out so that I can see all your beautiful faces.
That was amazing. So we do have at least one question. We have a lot of people doing virtual crafts right now. If you do want to ask a question, you can use the raise your hand button or type something in the chat, and then I'll call on you. We have a first question from Nicholas. Do you just want to go ahead and unmute yourself?
Here, I'll pull up the chat. Okay.
Thank you so much for a great talk. It was very inspirational. And I had a particular question on constructing the food web. I really enjoyed your description of the process. And I was curious if you could explain again if the links in the nodes are binary or weighted, and if not, how weighting them affects the vulnerability and connectedness.
Right. So I kind of glossed over that in the interest of time. So in the initial Pueblo food web, those are just binary. And the reason for that is I started that project 9 years ago, and the computational complexity of doing 12,000 weighted links is difficult. There are also questions in ecology of encounter rate, and while it may be easy-ish to model the weights that humans specifically had, looking at the weights for different predators on different prey is very difficult. And so when we're doing the full food webs, those are very structural and they're not dynamic. I've been working with a colleague at University of Washington, Spencer Wood, who's an ecologist, to develop ways of doing more dynamic analyses where we can play with those weights. That necessarily constrains our number of nodes and links because of the complexity of having that. And so what we end up doing is looking at functional redundancy. So like I mentioned, those hummingbirds, we'd collapse them down to one node, for example. And so in the work I showed you today, I was not showing you really much of the weightedness. With the discussion of humans and what they ate, I was showing weightedness there, and I did some simulations there. But in general, with the full food web and then with the Erdos-Renyi randomizations, those are just binary links. Does that answer your question, Nicholas?
Yeah, that does. Thanks so much.
I mean, to be honest, it's really difficult with the amount of data that there is there. And so we've been working on ways of doing more dynamic analyses. In terms of these analyses, it kind of follows the best practices that other network studies have done in this way. I agree that it's unsatisfying. Because we know 80% of the diet is maize. So if you remove that, that's going to have a very different kind of effect than removing something that's 0.1%. And so we kind of have to do it iteratively, where we have the big web and we can look at it that way. And then we can kind of look at these more dynamic, smaller webs. I think this field of network science is going to really go somewhere in the next few years. I know these are questions that other scientists who use networks like Mark Newman have been working on. And so I'm hopeful that in the next 10 years, we'll be able to move beyond kind of these different webs to ask these different questions.
So I don't see a raised hand at the moment, which is great for me because then I get to ask a question. And so I was very interested in something that you mentioned at the very end. So you said you were interested in interactions that aren't just connections in a food web, but more complicated than that. And I actually thought about that already when you were talking about your work on the Martu population, because the way that you described it with setting those fires and thereby changing the environment, that's not a direct interaction in the food web, right? That's something that kind of is more complicated than that. So how, in terms of formalizing that in a way that you can analyze them, how are you going about it?
Yes. Well, so these loop models that Spencer Wood and I are working on developing, we actually have fire as a node. And so fire consumes, and lightning fire consumes more than human fire. And so we have weighted scaling of these. And we also have the beneficial properties. So in loop models, you can look at not just the negative, like I eat this, it's dead, but we can look at the positives, like being a seed disperser. And so these create loops that you look at, you essentially let the model run forever until you see various outcomes. Like my prediction is that if we remove human-based fire, mala will go extinct eventually. You run hundreds of thousands of these models and see how often that happens, and look at what the loops are that create those chains over time. So in terms of the graphs that I just showed you, those are very simple. Just people use, wood, they use cedar to make clothing, for example. So that's one link. But within these loop models, that's where we get those kind of different kinds of beneficial and detrimental links. Does that answer your question? Did I go tangent?
In a way. So but you did say in your in the end that you're interested in other interactions, like for example transport and how humans bring other species together. Mm-hmm. So is there also some kind of trickery where you introduce extra nodes that account for that, or how do you do that?
Right now we are categorizing those data differently, and so mm-hmm. we have a giant relational database, essentially a graphical network database, and we can say we just want the trophic network. So here's humans eating things and other animals eating things. Or maybe we want to understand the complex human network within the trophic network. So we will have those consumption links of using a tree also for clothing. And so, right, this is all being done right now. So none of this is published yet. And mm-hmm. so we're still developing the techniques, but one of the things that's been really helpful for doing this is looking at kind of bridging network scores and centrality network scores of looking at the importance of certain taxa. So archaeologists like to talk about the importance of maize, for example, because people ate it. But other things that you might not see are the importance of various other taxa for ensuring your ability to get something else. So in the Northwest, the Pacific Northwest, where we're gathering data, the ability to go on a whale hunt for the macaw is dependent upon making a cedar canoe, which is dependent upon being able to do all these other things. And so getting all these dependencies together into a network shows the ways that people manipulate environments, and environments can manipulate people as well in a really complex manner that we really can't get at any other way. And so those are the kinds of ways that we're looking at this. And like I said, it's still under development, and I think is probably going to feed hundreds of master's and PhD projects over time, because people are looking at this both from anthropology, archaeology, and ecology. And I think that this data is already being able to help us have a better understanding of the ways that we are important in ecosystems. One thing I didn't think about or didn't talk about is that the work on Aboriginal fire, of course, was really important this last year. And I was interviewed by a few different people in the press because of this work, because it suggests the importance of Aboriginal landscape fires to suppress big fires. And you can only get at this if you do these complex systems networks approaches.
We have a question from Jithan.
I'm reading it.
Yeah.
You're welcome for bringing the cookies into the talk. I'm sorry I couldn't bring you real cookies. Right now, we do not have anyone who is working on the impact of human food waste on city ecosystems, because the things that we're working on right now are mostly, we would call them pre-industrial societies. And so archaeological societies or the Martu obviously are still living in fairly traditional life ways. But what this infrastructure is enabling is to be able to ask these kinds of questions. So one thing that I'm hoping to do with my Ancestral Pueblo work is work with modern Pueblo, and I've begun some conversations on that, to be able to move beyond these archaeological data, which honestly are easier to collect because you have these time slices to these modern lenses. But also, to the cookie point, that's taking these more pre-industrial societies and connecting them to industrial society. So I could see a way that we could look at your question, but nobody's done it. So maybe you should come do a postdoc with me, right? Dorian says, data collection to form these networks is very expensive. Yes. How does the future of data extraction look like? Are things getting digitized? The answer is yes, things are getting digitized. I originally had this data on a server that died, but I still, of course, have all of my data. One thing that archaeologists have actually been good at is creating digital databases long before it became the norm on what's known as TDAR, the Digital Archaeological Record. And so a lot of this work is moving toward there and being published there. It's been hard. A lot of this, thanks to my funders, has been hiring people to do the boring work. The reason I wear glasses now when I work, of sitting down staring at these old reports. These are getting digitized, they're easier to search. And as I'm collaborating with more and more data scientists, archaeologists, and ecologists, we're able to kind of gobble up more of this data in a principled manner. And of course, all of my work, I'm working toward it being open access, open source. Thanks for the question, Dorian. Or Doina, I said Dorian, I'm so sorry. I wasn't wearing my glasses.
I have another question from Anna. Are any of the pre-industrial societies included not seasonal? I recall from a map that all were from the Ecuador. Equator. Would this be relevant in terms of change over time?
So with Martu, we can look at seasonality really, really easily. We have one society that's the transition from hunting and gathering to the Neolithic in Europe, so that linear band ceramique society, and that is really difficult. So the longer you go back, the harder it is to get seasonality, just because the archaeological preservation is not so good. Most of these places have seasonality. Most of them are actually, we have things below the equator and above the equator. In some of the places we can get seasonality very easily, like Martu, Pueblo, Iceland, we can actually get seasonality pretty good. When people got to Iceland, they were already writing about things. So we have the archaeological record and we can read Old Norse texts, which is pretty cool. But it depends on the place. And this is a challenge for archaeology everywhere, is that some places it's easy to ask certain questions, and in other places it's easy to ask other questions. So that's why we have so many different study places.
Thank you, Stephanie. That was a great talk. I think a lot of people agree with me on that. Thanks so much for being here. And to everyone here, thanks for joining. And I'll send out an announcement soon for the next talk. And I'll see you hopefully next week.
Sounds great. And thank you very much for the invitation. And I hope everybody is safe and happy where you are. And shoot me a message on Twitter and email, and take care. Bye.
Bye.